as we left off, we were talking about kind of the developments of Europe at this point in time, especially when it comes to the issue of Western Europe. Now, one of the more fascinating aspects of what happens during this period in time is the consider the anti-pope crisis, and that's the term that we gave it. And this kind of really does mark the high point of the church's influence, but also the exposure of its inherent corruption. Remember, over the last 1,000 years, the Catholic Church in Western Europe has become the dominant religious and political force in this part of Europe. And with this, needless to say, comes a lot of authority, a lot of responsibility, but also a lot of corruption. And the anti-pope crisis is a prime example of this. So, um, whenever there is a pope needed to be elected, ever since the College of the Cardinals was created in the 12th century. So over the last 200 years, from this point that we're talking about, it's been a political fight and a political maneuver to try to get certain popes elected, particularly from whatever region. For example, if France always wanted a French pope, the English wanted an English pope. Just obvious for obvious reasons. Now, for a particular long period of time in the 14th century, there was a string of French popes. And starting in 1305, the French popes began moving most of the church bureaucracy from Rome to the city of Avignon. Now, if you follow my mouse cursor here, you can see here on the bottom, Avignon becomes of between 1305 and 1378 truly the seat of papal power in Europe. Now, the reason for this move was pretty simple. The French popes were hoping to kind of move away from the Italian influence in Rome and essentially, again, kind of show their loyalty to France and its people. Now, eventually, in 1378, the current pope, who's French, dies, and all of a sudden there is an election. Now, remember, as I mentioned before, the College of the Cardinals meets in Rome, and they basically go through a series of votes and elections to pretty much determine who gets to be the next pope. Now, eventually, however, a mob forms outside of the Vatican and pretty much informs the College of the Cardinals that if you do not elect an Italian pope, we will kill you all. Very simple and a very clear threat. So the College of the Cardinals responds by electing an Italian pope, in this case, Urban VI. So Urban VI is elected pope, who is an Italian, and immediately after the College of the Cardinal convenes as we call it, the French popes go back to the safety of France and pretty much say that this was a sham election, that there's no, that we were what we called under duress, which basically means that we were being blackmailed into, or our lives were threatened into electing this pope, Urban the sixth. And so the French cardinals got together in Avignon and elected one of their own, in this case Clement VII, as the next pope. So now you have two popes. You have Urban the sixth, the Italian, again, convening in Rome, and you have Clement VII, the Frenchman, convening in Avignon. So clearly you have a pope and an anti-pope. Now, eventually, it got to the point where, well, and we'll actually get to that in just a second, Carlos, very good. It got to the point, and the hostilities between the French and the Italians got to the point where eventually Urban VI excommunicated Clement VII and all of his followers. And in kind, Clement VII excommunicated Urban VI and all his followers. So basically, every single Catholic in Europe at one point in time was excommunicated by someone. Now, mind you, you have certain nations supporting certain popes. For example, France obviously supported the Pope in Avignon, as did Spain and a couple of other countries. Meanwhile, England and most of the Italian states, much of Germany, supported that of Rome. So it was clearly a political fight. I mean, keep in mind that there's no spirituality involved in this. It's basically all politics. Now, eventually, a council of cardinals, tired of this split between Catholic popes, decides to pretty much kind of resolve this by electing a new pope. In other words, we will have another pope who will be legitimate, and the other two popes will become illegitimate. And so the Council of Pisa elects Alexander V as its pope. But there's just one problem, is that the other two popes have absolutely no interest in resigning and quickly excommunicate him. And so for a brief period in time, for about a year, you have technically three popes, one in Avignon, one in Rome, and the other one in Pisa. Finally, after quite some time of this, a few years later, the cardinals finally come together and realize that this is tearing the church apart. Because remember, from the outside looking in, this is absolutely ridiculous. You have the position of the Pope, which is supposed to be the vicar of God. This word vicar, V-I-C-A-R, is basically the representation of God on earth, his representative, being being mocked, almost like a telenovela for lack of a better phrase. And so cardinals get together, finally elect a legitimate consensus pope, and the anti-pope crisis ends. Now, despite the fact that the anti-pope crisis finally came to an end, it causes tremendous damage to the prestige and to the respectability of the Catholic Church. Between this and its inability to do anything about the Black Death and a couple of other major controversial issues, you begin to see cracks in the grip that the church has on much of Europe. Right? And again, the fact that it kind of culminates in this ridiculousness of having popes and anti-popes and third popes, for many people, this was simply just an example of just how far the Catholic Church had fallen. Now, so you begin to see, now, despite the fact that it becomes dangerous, you begin to see many, many critics actually kind of rise up and begin not only talking about the criticism of the Catholic Church itself, but the criticism of Catholicism. An example of this is John Wycliffe. Now, John Wycliffe is technically a priest in England, and he begins, again, kind of talking about the abuses of the wealth of the higher clergy, like the bishops and the cardinals. Remember, many bishops and cardinals are incredibly wealthy. You have the dispute between many of the sacraments. Remember, in Catholicism, sacraments are the kind of required concepts that you need to do as a good Catholic, and this includes everything from taking communion to marriage to holy orders to final rites, etc., etc. And so, and even then, so again, you do have these Wycliffe, among others, kind of openly criticizing the church and its teachings, again, not just on the fundamental basis of politics, like, yeah, this anti-pope crisis is stupid, but actually kind of criticizing Catholicism openly, right? And this, in many ways, is considered to be the origin what will become, about 100 years later, the Protestant Reformation, right, which will begin in Germany about a century after John Wycliffe starts writing. Any questions? Okay, so we can now move on to chapter 13, which again will be the last section of our lecture series. Chapter 13 is one of my favorite things to talk about, simply because of the fact that it deals with something, well, basically the stuff I went to college for. So I'm happy I'm able to share that with you before the semester ends. Now, what we're going to be talking about here is pretty much what the Americas, both North and South America, look like, right before the arrival of the first Europeans. And so let's start with North America. And in North America, you obviously have a variety of different peoples, ideas, et cetera, et cetera. Now, obviously it kind of depends on kind of the geographic situation that we're in, but I want to focus on the on what we call the mound builders. Now, if you see here, the mound builders were not necessarily an empire or a kingdom, but it's essentially just a peoples bound together by the mounds that they built. And I think I have a picture of them here. Oh, forgive me, I don't. So these mounds are pretty much just, again, earthen mounds that look like shapes. Now you really can't see them from the ground, but if you actually are able to, view them from the air, an airplane or a helicopter, what have you, um, these mounds are pretty impressive. They take the shape of different animals, et cetera, et cetera. And their purpose at the time was essentially for burial mounds. But we'll talk about them in a while. Now, at the heart of this burial mound culture, you have Cahokia. Now, in Cahokia, you essentially have the kind of the largest city in North America, north of Mexico. Now, at one point in time, now this is located just right outside of what is now modern day St. Louis, Missouri, but it is here that you begin to see this pretty well developed large city developing that probably had a population at any point in time about 70, let me rephrase that, about 30,000 people. So about one point in time, 30,000 people live there, and mostly it's because of its location. Right, it is right on the Mississippi River, and it's kind of in this very, very strategically located, strategic location that is suitable for trade. Now, so because of its location, Cahokia is able to kind of develop into this relatively large and prosperous city. Now, outside of Cahokia, you essentially have, again, as I mentioned before, the issue of the mounds. Now, these mounds, again, number in the dozens, hundreds. As a matter of fact, early American settlers or Anglo-American settlers, as they're pushing westward, many of them actually ended up tearing down these mounds because they didn't know what they were. They just thought they were hills that just kind of ended up in particular places. And so uh, these mounds kind of serve in many instances as, as anything from temples, that were flattened at the top. So they served as temples, palaces, administrative buildings. Now, the largest of these was Monk's Mound. Monk's Mound rose probably about 100 feet and was the largest mound in North America. It probably was the residence of Cahokia's ruling family. So this mound is flat at the top, almost like a plateau situation, and it probably served as the residence for the ruling family of Cahokia. Now, an interesting other one is Mound 72. That's what archaeologists call this mound today. Mound 72 aligned with the winter summer solstice. So what this means is that when the sun, during the winter summer solstice, remember the summer solstice is the longest day of the year, the winter solstice is the shortest day of the year. On those particular 2 days, this mound kind of lines up perfectly with the sun rising and the sun setting. Um, in this mound, we discovered 272 individuals that were found buried in this mound. Now, interestingly enough, some of the people buried in this mound were buried with extreme care. They were buried with possessions. You could tell they were carefully placed, and you could tell that they were of wealth. But then you also have others who simply just kind of thrown in there with very little or nothing of terms of personal possessions. Now, we think that, and again, we really don't know what's going on, but we think that this is a prime example of this income disparity, where those of wealth were able to be buried with possessions and buried with care, while those without wealth were pretty much just essentially thrown into pits. Now, one of the mounds that we found here seemed to contain the remains of an early Cahokian ruler. And it seems that he was buried with more than 100 women. And these women seem to have been sacrificed and then buried. Now, this is still incredibly controversial. The idea of human sacrifice outside of Mesoamerica is one that is incredibly suspicious. But from the looks of it, it does appear that this particular individual was buried along with his harem, if you remember the phrase that we were talking about earlier. Now, around 1150 CE, a large wall was erected around the city of Cahokia, which kind of indicates to us that there was a local hostile force Now we really don't know who it was, but the fact that they built a wall suggests that eventually you do have war. Now we do know that Cahokia was abandoned around 1400. That seems to be the last year, or around 14. That seems to be the last era where Cahokia was actually settled. Many scholars believe it was caused by a combination of warfare, deforestation, and shortened growing season. And so again, Cahokia, the kind of the heart of this mound building culture, eventually becomes abandoned in 1400 because, again, of maybe possibly because of a combination of war, deforestation, and again, short growing seasons. Now, moving to the west, we have here the people known as the Pueblos. Now, again, much like the mound builders, the Pueblos are not united by language, by even by religion, culture. The one thing they have in common is the fact they build houses out of adobe. That's really the only kind of common bond that they have. That, and of course, their geographic proximity. Now, on the Colorado Plateau, here in what is now the Four Corners region of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, you have large pueblos consisting of several adobe structures, and a large kiva were constructed. Around 900, the residents began to adopt corn agriculture as their main source of food. Now, I want to bring your attention this word here that I am pointing to right now, kiva. A kiva is a semi sort of meeting place for a local town, but it's also served as a religious center as well. All right, so it's kind of serves kind of both purposes, kind of a communal gathering place, but it also serves a religious purpose as well. And usually, most non-Pueblo peoples aren't allowed inside the actual kiva. It's kind of, think of it like a kind of a circular space, but it's dug underground and it's covered, so it's kind of like a dome, if in a sense. But again, it's part meeting place, part part religious gathering location. Now, the place I want to refer to specifically here is the area of what is now western New Mexico, called Chaco Canyon. Now, it's here in Chaco Canyon around 500 CE that people began to build villages in the southern part of the canyon, which does see pretty large amounts of rainfall. Now, of these communities, the largest one is Pueblo Bonito. Pueblo Bonito reached 5 stories high and has 600 rooms. This is Pueblo Bonito here. Now, the people seem to identify themselves into 2 separate groups: the summer people and the winter people. Now, this is very important. The summer people are those who farmed, while the winter people are those who hunted and gathered. It seems that their division of labor was divided by their occupation. They either farm or they hunt, hence the name summer, which again implies farming, and the winter, which of course implies gathering. Now, keep in mind, despite the fact that this particular area has more rainfall than other places, it's important to note that, excuse me, that this ecosystem, that of the American Southwest, cannot sustain agriculture at this point in time. Or in other words, you cannot have a complete transition into agriculture at this point in time. All right, hunting and gathering is still an important resource and an important way of collecting protein and calories. Again, because the amount of agriculture produced in this region cannot sustain a population throughout the year. Now, as the population grew, the already fragile ecosystem could not sustain a large population. And so you begin to see the expansion of these people into various different communities, as you can see here on this map. Those red dots indicate different villages and towns established by these Pueblo builders. Now, one of the things that we notice here is a large network of roads being created. The roads were 40 feet wide in the canyon and 10 feet wide beyond it. Now, you can see here on this map just where the roads point to. These lines in orange represent the road networks that the Pueblos created, but no one really knows what the roads were used for. Some believe that they were used for during religious services, and others believe that they were merely symbolic. Some represented the arteries and veins of the human body. Now, around 1150 CE, you begin to see this area being abandoned originally. Now, it was assumed that a severe drought caused this. Now, interesting enough, what happens eventually is that these people who settled in the Chaco Canyon and the surrounding Four Corners region, many of them eventually migrate eastward into the Rio Grande Valley. All right, and it is there that they will establish new pueblos, and eventually this is where the Spanish will encounter them when they begin first arriving in the area around 1520. Now, no, I'm sorry, not 1520, 1580. Let me see here. I know one of you had a question. Or yes, I'm sure that's exactly what the answer was. Now, the further south into what we now call Mexico, you have the rise of the Toltecs. Now, the Toltecs seem to have come into, now before we actually talk about the Toltecs, I want to talk about the particular region that we'll focus on for the next couple of slides, that of the Valley of Mexico. This region you see here around Lake Texcoco is, and what we now call today Mexico City, or what we used to call the Efe, is is kind of the heart of what we're going to be talking about today. Now, this region here is incredibly seismically active, constant earthquakes and volcanoes, but it also works to the benefit, especially that of volcanoes. The constant volcanic activity also enriches the soil in this region. And so the Valley of Mexico becomes incredibly agriculturally productive. Now, around 800 or 900, the same droughts that may have wiped out the Chaco Canyon civilization eventually caused certain Indian tribes from northwestern Mexico, what is now Chihuahua, Durango, et cetera, to move into the Valley of Mexico and begin settlements there. Now, eventually, we believe that these new migrants eventually settled and built a city of their own called Tula, which, as far as we can tell, had as many as maybe 80,000 people at its height. That contained 2 large temples and 5 ball courts. Now, although it never reached the same level of grandeur as, say, if you remember from our previous conversation about central Mexico, Teotihuacan, it was an important trading site. You do have materials that were originally created as far away as Costa Rica being found in archaeological sites here in Tula. Now, there are some scholars that have pointed out the similarities in architecture between Tula and Chaco Canyon, believing, and again, the idea is that the same people who built Tula are the same inhabitants who had built Chaco Canyon. But again, this is all just speculation now, because we really don't have any solid evidence that they were one and the same. Now, eventually, however, despite the impact of or at least the power and influence that the Toltec actually created, at one point in time conquering nearly the entirety of the Valley of Mexico, eventually you begin to see more and more migrants from northern Mexico, particularly that of the Chichimecas, arrive here in central Mexico. Now, we can't assume that all these nomads were hostile. There was evidence that Toltec settlements were attacked violently, and eventually it seems that the Toltecs were forced to abandon their capital of Tula around 1150 and never really recovered. Now, I think I talked about the Chichimecas before. They're one of the more fascinating groups of people. Now, keep in mind the Chichimecas are not a tribe. It's kind of a catch-all term for different tribes. In other words, you have different various groups of people speaking different languages, but much like the Pueblos, for example. Remember I was telling you that the Pueblos are not united by language, by culture, by religion. They just given this catch-all term, Pueblo, because they build towns out of adobe. Well, the Chichimecas are the same thing. The Chichimecas aren't united in any way, shape, or form. They just happen to be nomadic peoples who are really good at war. As a matter of fact, the word Chichimeca comes from the Nahuatl word called dog people, which is not a compliment. All right, clearly they had disdain for the Chichimecas. Now, the Chichimecas, as I mentioned, I think I may have mentioned this earlier, but I'll reiterate, are incredibly effective warriors. Now, when the Spanish arrive in Mexico and eventually conquer this region of Mexico City and the surrounding regions, which we'll later call the Aztecs, a few years after their conquest, they begin sending settlers and others northwards. And the settlers begin reporting back that their caravans and their little villages were being attacked by these Chichimecas. And so the governor of Mexico, or the viceroy of Mexico, the governor, orders a expedition to travel northward to basically pacify. That's the word that is used a lot in this particular, in this particular colonial era, to pacify the Chichimecas. Now, the Spanish don't have enough soldiers to do that, so they're dependent a lot on what we call Indian auxiliaries, which basically means Indian soldiers that serve the Spanish crown. And so they had been loyal up until this point. And so the Spanish go to the Indian auxiliaries and say, "Hey, you're going to help us, defeat the defeat the Chichimecas." And the Indian auxiliaries apparently go, "Yeah, no, we're not. We're not going up there. The Chichimecas are psychopaths, and we're terrified of them." So the Spanish went at them, and a few months later, they come back and they report to the viceroy and they say, "Yeah, they're complete psychopaths." And I think I might have mentioned this is because, first of all, they in battle, they fight completely nude, which to conservative Catholics is, needless to say, incredibly terrifying. Even then, they dye themselves using this particular plant that grows in northern Mexico. They dye themselves blue, and even then they kind of use the same material to spike up their hair. So imagine this naked blue person running at you with a either a spear, an axe, what have you. But yeah, it took the Spanish 130 years to actually pacify the Chichimecas. All right, so it's a very interesting story and a very interesting concept that kind of comes out of this. So nevertheless, before we talk about the Aztecs, we have to discuss the issue of that of the Nahuas. Now, the word Nahua actually refers to the language. Now, the people of the people who speak the Nahua language, or Nahuatl. Now, just keep in mind, I'm going to be using this word a lot, so I'll excuse me. Now, that's usually the term that we use it now, Nahua, but the actual term used in the language itself is Nahuatl. Now, just FYI, many, not all, but many of the words in this language end with the TL. And a lot of words that we use today in Spanish, particularly Mexican Spanish, come from this. But when the Spanish came, like for example, chocolate was chocolato. So you have aguacate was aguacato. The Spanish, when they first came and started learning language, they found these words to be incredibly difficult to say. And so they just, instead of saying chocolato, they said chocolate. Aguacato became aguacate. But again, just as an example of this, and Nahuatl became Nahua. So Nahua, Nahuatl, same thing. Okay, just FYI. Now, Nahuatl is a part of the family known as the Uto-Aztecan language family. And there are different variations of this particular language. The Hopi people of Arizona, the Shoshone as far north as what is now Idaho, the Comanche, and the Tarumaran, all are same members of the same family. All right, now, the particular group of people, the particular group of Nahuas that we're referring to, eventually migrate into the Valley of Mexico around 1300 CE. Now, we really don't know their original homeland per se. In other words, we can't point to a particular point of the map and say this is where the eventual Aztecs would come from. Now, we do. The only thing that we can gather is that the Aztecs often refer to their traditional homeland as Aztlan. But we really don't know where it is. Most historians believe that it was probably somewhere in this region here, what we now call the American Southwest. And so regardless of where it is, you begin to see them migrate into this region here. Now, many of the Nahua groups settled in the Valley of Mexico, where they eventually begin forming city-states and begin kind of kind of forming. So the Valley of Mexico really does become almost like ancient Greece, if you remember, where you basically have a collection of city states as opposed to a single polity. Now, each of these city states is known as an Atapetal. Again, an Atapetal is a city state. Each of these city states had a ruler, a patron deity, and a defined territory. Now, even then, the cities themselves were divided into neighborhoods or wards known as capuli. Now, again, these capuli are how the cities divide themselves for political and family reasons. Now, men, you do have specific gender roles, like in many societies where you have men went out to farm and making crafts, and occasionally went out to war, while women stayed home and tended to their families. And so, again, you do have some commonalities among the different political entities in the Valley of Mexico. In addition, you'd also have severe, rigid social hierarchies. Commoners did most of the farming, household labor, artisanry, and fighting. Surplus food was given to the leaders of each capuli. Then each capuli sent the surplus to the ruler of the Etapeto as tribute. So again, just so we're clear, the commoners would give any excess goods that they created, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whatever, and would give it to the local leaders of each capuli, of each neighborhood, or each ward. And then each of the rulers of the capuli would give it to the chief of the Atapeto. Now, most of the nobles owned slaves. Now, most of the slaves were prisoners of war, though debtors and criminals could also be enslaved as well. Now, because of the volcanic activity in the area, the Valley of Mexico contained nitrogen-rich soil. And this is where you have the construction of these chinampas. Now, I know I've talked about them before, but remember, these chinampas are kind of these floating islands. These islands that you begin to see the production of agriculture on. Remember, they're self-sustaining. You really don't need to water them because they get, they're basically built on lakes. And so the water really just, the water just comes from under the ground. And even then, the fish that live in the lake, they die, they breed, they defecate, which of course increases nitrogen outtake, which makes it perfect for, again, as I mentioned before, agriculture. Now, trade was an important part of the life of the Valley of Mexico. All right, the Atapetos controlled most of the merchants called pochetas. Remember, these pochetas are merchants that mostly do the service of the Atapeto. In other words, remember, compare this to private merchants who do business for themselves. The pochetas, they're in business for their Atapetos. They take their orders from whatever city state they work for. Now, they not only accumulated much wealth, but they also worked as spies. So they served two purposes, really. Yes, they serve as merchants and they can accumulate a lot of wealth, but they also end up serving as spies for whatever Atapeto they serve. Now, it is estimated that by 1400, the Valley of Mexico had nearly 2 million people living in it. There are some estimates that have that number as high as nearly 15 million. The population of North America, especially the Valley of Mexico, is one that is incredibly still controversial because we really don't. I mean, we have some idea, but even then, we also are just kind of guessing. It is a heavily populated region, and it always has been, but just how populated is still something that is to this day very controversial. Now, the so as I mentioned before, so this is the picture of, or what the Valley of Mexico looked like at the time that the Spanish arrived in this particular region. As you can see here, it is incredibly dense, and you see the Atapetos here. Tlacopan, Chapultepec, Coyoacan. So you have all of these, and of course, at the heart of this will become eventually Tenochtitlan, which we'll talk about in just a sec. Remember, these are the chinampas. As you can see here, they're literally artificial islands built in the middle of lakes and canals. And again, the purpose is to kind of increase the prosperity of the soil as such. Where am I here? Okay. I'm actually really good on time. So I think I'm going to propose something to you all. Well, no, I can't, unfortunately. Um, Actually, yes, I can. So I'm actually covering this a lot faster than I thought I would. So I'm going to stop my share here